We're continuing our study on growing older and wiser. And so last week our discussion centered around this idea that there are times when we may need to share our wisdom with someone who just simply will not listen to us. I think we've all been in those situations before. And it's especially frustrating, I think. It adds an extra layer of pain and turmoil when it's a family member. And a lot of times it's a child or a grandchild. It makes it even more complicated when it's an adult child. You know, it's one thing to try to discipline a little kid, but when they get to be, 17 or 40 or whatever, it's a little more difficult to talk to them. It presents some special problems. And of course, when we see a family member like that going down a path that we know either intuitively or through personal experience that it's going to lead to consequences if they don't change course, well, obviously we want to step in and intervene, and we want to give them some fatherly or motherly advice, but sometimes they just don't want to accept that. You'll recall from last week that as we were doing this discussion, we talked about Rehoboam. And you'll remember that Rehoboam was the first king of Judah after the split. The United Kingdom of Israel split off. The 10 northern tribes went their own way. They were under the kingship of somebody different. Rehoboam led the southern kingdom, which was made up of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Part of his story, he's mentioned in a few places in the Old Testament, but part of his story, and the one that we looked at last week, was from 1 Kings chapter 12. So if you were here last week, you remember that we said that at about the age of 41, Rehoboam becomes king over Judah. And we look at that and we say, okay, 40. When we were 40, we thought we were pretty knowledgeable and experienced, and now we look back. I know I do. I look back and I realize that 40 is pretty young and inexperienced. But at the age of 40, Rehoboam becomes king of Judah. This split comes as the result of Rehoboam's arrogance. Now, we could argue that it actually goes back to the sins of his father. Rehoboam's father, you'll remember, was King Solomon, and King Solomon did a lot of wonderful things. He had a lot of wisdom, but in spite of that, he also disobeyed God by intermarrying with foreign princesses and introduced idolatry into Israel. And because of that, God says, I'm going to punish you by ripping your kingdom out of your hand. But I'm not going to do that during your lifetime. It's your heir that's going to suffer from this. And of course, the heir was Rehoboam. Rehoboam was next in line to be the king. So God basically says, Rehoboam is going to take your kingdom from you after you die, but he's only going to have a portion of it. So it was preordained that Rehoboam was only going to have control over part of the kingdom. But we can also say that Rehoboam was directly involved in this split happening because of his arrogance. Because what happened was, when King Solomon died, you'll remember that Rehoboam is basically, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that he's going to become the king. The people, the Israelites, approach Rehoboam and say, okay, if you're going to be the king, we ask that you lighten our load, because King Solomon had a lot of these building projects, and he used a lot of forced labor. He was evidently a very harsh king in that respect, and the people came to Rehoboam and said, we want you to ease up on us. Don't be as hard on us as you were, or as your father was. So Rehoboam considers this, And he first turns to some advisors. He turns to some older, wiser men that had served under his father, King Solomon. And he asks them, what do you think about this? What should I do? Do you remember how they replied? They gave him some wise counsel. They said, basically they told him that if you want to be king, the way to do that and to succeed is to be a servant to your people and not the other way around. And they said, they told Rehoboam that if you will listen to the people and do what they're asking of you and be their servant, that they will serve you and they will be loyal to you for the rest of your life. Was that what Rehoboam, was that the answer he was fishing for? No. He did not like their answer, so who did he turn to next? He turned to the people that I think he knew all along what kind of answer they were going to give him, and it was going to be the answer he wanted to hear. He turned to a younger set of advisors. Scripture says that they were the same age as Rehoboam, and in fact, he had grown up with them. Okay, so they had the same set of life experiences that he had, and the same amount of experience, and so they're going to think pretty much exactly like he is, and he knows that. He knows that when he goes and asks them, "What do you think I should do? Should I lighten up on the people?" He already knows what they're going to tell him, and they tell him, not only should you not lighten their load, you should exert your power over them. You should go out and say that you thought my dad, King Solomon, was bad. I'm going to be worse. So get ready. And so then we have the split. The 10 northern tribes thumbed their nose at Rehoboam. Jeroboam, you'll recall, had served under Solomon. He had gone into exile because early on, when he was still serving under Solomon, he had started to try to plot to become king then. They found out about it. He goes back goes to Egypt, goes into hiding. The Pharaoh protects him. He hears that Solomon has died. He says, "Here's my chance." And so he comes back to Israel and inserts himself into the picture. And of course, he's popular among the people because he represents an alternative to Rehoboam. And so anyway, because of Rehoboam's arrogance and his unwillingness to listen to dissenting opinions, he loses his kingdom, or at least most of it. He only listened to the advice that aligned with what he wanted to hear. So to wrap up last week's lesson, there are a couple of points I think we can come away with from the story of Rehoboam. And the first one that I think we can extract from this story is that when we seek other people's wisdom, which I hope we do, sometimes we don't want to, but when we do seek out somebody else's advice or wisdom, we should be disciplined enough and we must be mature enough to listen to the advice of people who are willing to tell us the truth. A lot of times when we ask other people's advice, we want affirmation, don't we? And I think Dr. May was the one who brought this up, that it's in our human nature to want to be affirmed. That's not always what we need. Maybe what we think we need, but what we really need is when we seek somebody's advice, not affirmation, but for them to tell us the truth. And it's like I said last week, I think it was, Justin, one of the things that he said in his sermon that stuck with me is that a good friend will not stab you in the back, but they will stab you in the front. So that's stuck with me. The second thing that I think we can draw from this story about Rehoboam is that when we're the ones offering advice to someone else, we need to remember that when they refuse to listen, when we're in that situation where the truth is obvious to us, the solution to the problem is obvious, and we keep telling them, we keep trying to persuade them to see our perspective, and they just won't do it. They just won't listen. We need to be reminded that as frustrating as that situation is, and as hopeless as it may seem sometimes, that we need to take comfort in knowing that God is constantly at work in other people's hearts and our own hearts. I'm sure all of us have been involved in situations or know of situations where you're trying to counsel someone and it may take years and years, and you're trying to get them to see a different perspective, and they just won't listen. But that whole time, God is softening their heart up to hear what they need to hear the truth. And we need to be reminded that when we look at a situation where it seems impossible to us, that everything is possible with God. He's always, we need to have faith in God that He's always working toward the best outcome for each of us. Okay, so that provides a pretty good segue into this week's lesson, which centers around growing wiser by faith and learning to trust in God in dealings with our family. You'll probably recall from previous weeks, we've talked about how wisdom does not come automatically from growing older. We hope that as we do age, that we are becoming more wise, but it's not just wisdom from our collected life experiences. The kind of wisdom we're seeking is godly wisdom, and we know that if that's what we're after, that it's something that we have to ask for. We know from Scripture that God tells us if we ask for it, He'll give it to us. But it's something that we have to seek out, and we also have to be willing to allow our faith to be tested for us to become more mature and to be able to attain that wisdom. So let me ask a question, and if somebody is brave enough to answer it, we'll let you speak up. But if you want to just think about it, that's fine. No, you don't have to necessarily answer. None of us really like to look back on the mistakes that we've made in the past. But we know that reflection is necessary for us to know how to improve ourselves, to how to do better. So from time to time, I hope we do. I hope we don't dwell on our mistakes, but I do hope we reflect on some of the things that we might have thought or said or done in the past, and learn from those. So what I want you to do is go back in your minds 20, maybe 30 years, and think about, ask yourself, is there anything I would do differently? So go back 20 or 30 years and think about your life from that point forward. Is there anything you would do differently? And like I said, if you want to speak up, that's fine. If you don't, while you're thinking about that, I'll tell you what first popped into my mind. I didn't really think about a specific event where I had made a mistake. That's not to say I haven't made plenty of mistakes. I made a lot of them when I was 20 or 30 years younger. But I guess the thing that stood out to me, that if I could change anything about the last 20 or 30 years, I got to thinking about the amount of time that I have wasted on things that I thought were important at the time, or things that I wanted to do. And looking back on it now, I think I could have been spending a lot of that time in prayer and getting a deeper understanding of Scripture. And that's one of my regrets, I guess, that I haven't spent more time studying my Bible, because I think, boy, if I had studied that diligently for the past 20 years, I would be so much further ahead in my walk. So that's the first thing that popped into my head. But, all of us we probably have events in our lives where we can point to that time and say, I would have done that differently if I had really put my faith in God, or that situation would have had a much different outcome if I had fully put my trust in God instead of trusting myself. And that's another thing that I look back on and see how much I've trusted in myself and not trusted in God. But if you want to go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 24, we are going to look at verses 1 through 9 in just a little bit. Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. So today we're going to look at a story from the life of Abraham. Without question, Abraham was beloved by God. But just like ourselves and like a lot of other biblical figures, Abraham was not perfect. And we can point to a few instances in his life where we might argue that he did not fully put his trust in God. We can think about a couple of different occasions where Abraham passed his wife off, Sarah, passed her off as his sister to save his own life, to spare his own life. Okay, maybe he should have put more faith in God that God would keep him safe during those situations. We also know that after God had promised Abraham that he would have a son, not too long after that, Sarah comes to Abraham and persuades him to conceive a child because she believes that there's no chance whatsoever that she'll ever have children. And she persuades Abraham to conceive a child with her maidservant, Hagar. And of course, that union produces Ishmael. And so we might look at that and say that, Ishmael was not the child that God had promised when he entered into that covenant with Abraham. And we might say, Abraham should have listened to God and maybe not listened to Sarah. Anyway, so there's a few instances there where we see that Abraham, just like us, may not have always put his trust in God. So, before we read this, just to kind of catch you up to where we are in this part of Abraham's story, in Genesis 24, Abraham he's up in years. Sarah has already died, and Abraham he's concerned about something. He's concerned about a family matter. He's wanting to get Isaac a wife. That's what he's worried about right now. And as we read this, I think we can see, we're going to get the sense that Abraham knows that his time is limited. He's nearing the end of his life, and maybe he sees this as the last, most important thing he needs to accomplish before he dies, is to find a suitable wife for Isaac. So let's read Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 through 9, and we'll discuss it for a little bit. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the chief servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" Abraham answers him, "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," Abraham said. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' He will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Okay. So Abraham is looking for a suitable mate for Isaac. Abraham we all know, Abraham has entered into this covenant with God. He's up in years. His wife Sarah is up in years. Neither one of them think that they're going to have children. And God comes to him and says, "I'm going to give you a son. And not only am I going to give you a son, I'm going to make you the father of a great nation. And their number is going to be more numerous than the stars in the sky." So the first part of that promise has been fulfilled with the birth of Isaac. But now as Abraham approaches the end of his life, he is wanting to see to it that promise is further fulfilled through Isaac. So Isaac has got to get a wife and produce a family of his own. Abraham is not just concerned, though, about Isaac producing offspring. Okay, it goes deeper than that. There are plenty of young women there in Canaan that Isaac can be married to. But Abraham gives some very specific instructions about who he wants his servant to go and find. He wants him to go and bring back a young woman from his own people. Now, we can know how serious this matter is to Abraham by seeing how he interacts with his servant. First of all, that we don't know, it doesn't say who this servant is here, but we can speculate that it may be Eliezer. Because if you go back to, I think, chapter 15 of Genesis, Eliezer is mentioned as being the chief servant of Abraham. This is where God is about to go into this covenant with Abraham, and Abraham is telling God, I don't have anybody I don't have any children. You haven't blessed me with any children, and so my estate is going to go to my chief servant, and that's Eliezer. So we speculate that this is Eliezer that he's entrusting this task to. Now the thing about when they get ready to, Abraham gets ready to tell his servant what he wants him to do, he tells him to place his hand under his thigh. Thank goodness, in this day and age, we enter into agreements with one another by shaking one another's hands. But that was a different culture. And so the servant knew when Abraham asked him to do this, that this was a serious and solemn matter. He's telling him, listen to what I'm telling you to do, and do it. The thing about him telling the servant to place his hand under his thigh is, and not to be indelicate, but the servant was placing his hand near the part of Abraham's body that was marked by circumcision. And of course, circumcision is God's symbol of covenant. So they were basically, Abraham was saying, we're entering into a covenant with one another. This is a serious deal. Now, let me ask this question. Why do you think it was so imperative to Abraham that his son not intermarry with a Canaanite? They were living right there in Canaan. There were plenty of Canaanite women to choose from. Why was it so important for Abraham to say, no, you go back to my country and you find a young lady from there? Look at Exodus, if you want to turn over there, you don't have to, but look at Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 through 16. This might help us understand why it was so important for Abraham to send his servant outside of Canaan to find a wife. In Exodus 34, 11 through 16, this is, you'll recall that Moses had the Ten Commandments, and in his anger he broke them. And so later on God instructs him to chisel out 2 more tablets, and he says, I'm going to reinscribe the Ten Commandments on this replacement set of tablets. So at this point in Exodus 34, Moses has followed God's command. He's got the tablets. And before God inscribes the Ten Commandments on these replacement stones, he talks to Moses. And this is part of what he tells him. God says, obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. We understand already that they're idol worshippers. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. God already knows what's going to happen. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. Now, obviously, this command not to intermarry with the Canaanites among these other people was obviously given long after Abraham was gone. But many of the commandments that were given to the Israelites after the Exodus, after they left Egypt, those were already in place. Many of them were already in place as rules before they were codified into law after the Exodus. So we can presume that even though during the time of Abraham, this may not have been necessarily law, we can presume that intermarriage with descendants of Canaan was not seen as acceptable for Hebrews. All of the 7 nations that were listed in what we just read, except for the Perizzites, because nobody really knows where the Perizzites originated from, but the other 6 groups of people that are listed are descendants of Canaan. Now, if you go way back to your early Bible, Old Testament knowledge, do you remember who Canaan's father was? Ham. You remember Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Who was their father? Noah. Okay. So Canaan is a direct descendant of Ham. Ham is a direct descendant of Noah. You'll remember after the flood, they've exited the ark, and what does Noah plant? He plants a vineyard. He gets him some grapes. And what does he make out of those grapes? Makes some wine, and it's evidently pretty good stuff because he drinks too much of it. You remember the story. I always laughed at it when I was a kid, but Noah gets inebriated. He goes into his tent and I guess goes to sleep, and he's uncovered. He's in an immodest state of dress. And Ham walks into the tent and sees his father. And instead of sparing Noah this embarrassment, what does he do? He leaves the tent and he goes and he tells his other 2 brothers. I can imagine him, kind of snickering about it and saying, go look in there. But the other 2 brothers honor their father, they go in and they get him covered up without looking at him. And Noah finally sobers up and he realizes what has happened. And what does he do to Ham? He's angry with him and he curses him. Actually, he curses his offspring. So he puts a curse on Canaan. Okay, so from that point forward, Canaan and his descendants are seen as a cursed people. So, okay, back to Abraham. There may have been a couple of reasons why Abraham did not want his son to intermarry with a Canaanite woman. And we just talked about one, that the Canaanites were seen as being cursed people because of Ham's indiscretion with his father. And also, it's possible that Abraham saw that intermarrying with the Canaanites could lead Isaac or his descendants to be distracted from worshiping God and to take up the worship of their gods. I want to ask you a question that we're going to not be able to finish this today, but I do want to ask a question as we consider what Abraham is dealing with. He's concerned, obviously, to him this is a very serious situation. And he has asked his servant, he says, please do not, whatever you do, choose a wife from these Canaanites. Please go back to my homeland and choose someone from there for my son. Can we identify with what Abraham is thinking and what he's going through? We think about our own children or our grandchildren. What is one of our greatest desires for them? To find a Christian spouse. And that's tough sometimes because we don't have control over who our kids or our grandkids choose. We can influence our kids. We can teach them. We can bring them up to believe certain things and instill certain values in them and teach them from the Bible. But ultimately, they're going to choose who they want to marry. So we understand Abraham's concern that he wants Isaac to marry someone who is going to help him to fulfill this promise that God has made of creating the nation of Israel. And so he has to be very careful about who is chosen. I didn't get into